All right, students, welcome back again. We're going to try something a little bit different this time. We're going to just have me do an audio overlay of the PowerPoint, and let's see how this works. Now, please let me know if you like this style. If not, we'll go ahead and go back to you seeing my wonderful smiling face throughout these videos. Hopefully, though, the idea behind this is that it'll take me less time to record these. All right, so we're going to move in here now to 27.3, the birth of the Civil Rights Movement. And so we're going to first talk about the origins of how the Civil Rights Movement kicks off here in the late 1940s and into the 1950s. Now, when we first think about the Civil Rights Movement, we think, well, what happened after the Civil War? I mean, weren't they granted equal rights? We learned about the 14th and 15th Amendment. They're supposed to all be equal now. And so one of the things is that if we remember correctly and we go back to the lessons that we've been learning and we've been taught, is that the South has restricted their freedoms immensely. And not only has it happened in the South, but a lot of times in the North and in the West, they've just naturally moved African Americans to the side and out of sight. This idea that comes about is what's known as the invisible person theory. And what that meant is that African Americans, who make up 10% of the American population, are just treated as invisible. And how do you treat an entire group, 10%, one of every 10 people, as invisible? Well, you basically remove them from key portions of society. And what do I mean? Well, if you were to go to the movie theaters, you would never see a black protagonist for the most part. In fact, if you were to watch television, you'd see pretty much no black characters on TV, no African American families. Often, if there was an African American person that would show up, usually it was there for comic relief. Even on the radio, the most popular program that was supposed to star African Americans was done by two white men, which is Amos and Andy. And even traditional and emerging African American artists were often removed and kept off the radio too. So everyday life was just basically devoid of African American representation in society. And that's why they become what we call at that time invisible. Furthermore, when it was going on during that time frame, a lot of them were not quite yet moved into the city, so many of them still lived out on the outer fringes in the rural territories, especially in the South. But World War II changes a lot of those things. So let's talk really quickly about World War II. Well, one of the things that they look at and they look around as they're fighting in World War II is the realization that they're out here fighting for American freedoms and American ideals to free the Western world from the grips of Nazism, tyranny, and eventually communism. Yet they look back at their own homes and they say, well, we're not equal over there. In fact, we're treated as second-class citizens. We're over here fighting to free these people, yet we have no freedoms. That doesn't make sense. And so they start up this idea of what's known as the Double V campaign, which is victory abroad and victory at home. What does that mean? Well, they would win the war, but then when they came home from the war, they would fight for their rights. They would fight to become equal. And the inspiration for this comes from James Thompson, who writes a letter to the editor, and he really writes about, should I sacrifice to live half American? Why are they over there overseas sacrificing if they come home and they aren't treated the same? And so they really take up this mantra and they come home and they start to fight racial discrimination via getting rid of poll taxes and also trying to get representation back in the political arena again. The other thing, though, that they sought to get equality in is in education. Getting equality in education is key at all times because equality in education lets you start on an even foundation as virtually everybody else. If you can read, write, and you can effectively communicate, you can often go further than if you're illiterate and have access to little to no formal education. And so they really seek to change and educate the African American population and make sure that they can compete just as equally as white Americans during this time. And so there's a lot of different trials and things we're going to talk about when it comes down to them fighting for equality in education. Now, how do they start off this movement? Well, they really start to show, like President Truman, some of the problems that were happening. he looks at the military and he realizes that African Americans are not being treated fairly in the military. They're in desegregated units. They're often prevented from working frontline jobs or jobs that can give them a skill set that once they leave the military can translate into civilian life. Another thing is he finds is that the GI Bill is not applying equally. It's mainly going to white soldiers to improve their education, to improve their ability to find housing, and African Americans are left out of that equation too. So whites are naturally given a leg up in the 1950s economy. So one of the things he does is he approaches Congress and he really tries to make some major changes. However, a lot of the things that he proposes and that he tries to put into place is blocked by Congress. He does manage to get a few laws passed, like they move lynching into a federal legal category. So now if states try to turn a blind eye to the idea of somebody being lynched, the federal government can then step in and prosecute those people. We talked about integration, and then he also worked to eliminate the poll tax, again, trying to get him better access to the political process. One of the biggest things, though, that he does is that he really brings to light this struggle that African Americans are having. He tries to take it out of the shadows and brings it front and center. And he's the first president to do this since the end of the Civil War. So it is a very important step forward to bring attention to these societal issues that African Americans are facing. So who is one of the big players that changes this? And I kind of use players too in the same sense. Well, that's Jackie Robinson. So what makes him so important and so impactful? I know often people read about Jackie Robinson. They're like, oh, yeah, first African-American baseball player. But why is that so important? Well, during this time, Major League Baseball is the most popular sport in the United States. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people within a locale would know and follow their sports teams. In fact, they would watch it on TV. They would attend the games in person. They'd read about it in the newspaper and listen to it on the radio. And Jackie Robinson, when he shows up, he is now a face of the African American community. He's bringing them out of the shadows. He's erasing that idea and concept of the invisible person. He's showing everybody that yes, African Americans are around. Yes, they can compete equally, if not better, in baseball. So he brings, again, what he does is he pulls them into popular culture. He allows them to start existing in the realm of American ideas. And so that was one of his big breakthroughs for this, even though he's a great baseball player, and we shouldn't forget that. But nonetheless, he starts to change the ideas that people have on what African Americans can do. And eventually, we start to see other teams start to desegregate and hire African American baseball players too. Another thing that really changes is that during the wartime, African Americans move out of the countryside and into the cities and take jobs in factories, and they learn important skill sets so they're able to be economically competitive. And also, when there's a large grouping and gathering of people in one particular location, as we've learned, if they all have shared interests, they can create an enormous amount of political influence. And so they seek to try to instill and use that political influence in order to shift policies that would benefit them and help them out. And so this becomes very important. Now, admittedly, in the Deep South, they do lose a lot of that political influence and political voice through restrictive government actions. So it does take a lot more effort for those in the South to reach political influence over those in other areas of the country. So one of the things that we start to look at is then what's the next fight? Instead of just looking at the invisible person, where do they go next? Well, if we remember in our unit when we start talking about the era of progressivism, we remember the establishment of the NAACP. And what they start to do is they start to sue for African American rights. They start to use the legal system in order to promote the idea of African American rights in society. They start to really say, look, the 14th and 15th Amendment are not applying equally to everybody like they were supposed to. I mean, you're talking about amendments that are 100% based on making everybody equal. And so they start to sue. And in 1940, the NAACP is now headed up by Thurgood Marshall, who is an incredible legal mind and a very talented lawyer. In fact, so much so that eventually he is moved to the Court of Appeals and is the first African American on the Supreme Court. However, during this time frame, he takes up the cause to finally bring an end to Plessy v. Ferguson. If we remember, that is the case where it was ruled that separate but equal is okay and it applies, meaning that African Americans can be placed in separate schools. They can be discriminated and moved to different areas in a city. They could be forced to not be able to patronize locations as long as there was a quote-unquote equal location for them to be. And he really challenges this idea that the equality that's supposed to be promoted is not equal. And one thing that he really looks at is schools. So when he says, well, look, let's take a view at the schools. Let's see how equal they really are. And so if you look at a couple of the pictures that I've included in here, the one on the very top, if you look at the side over on the left, that is an African American auditorium. As you can see, they have very cheap seats. It's disorganized. It's not in great shape yet. If you look on the other side, this would be a white school auditorium. As you see, it's well kept, nice chairs. And the same goes for like the classrooms. I know I put a very extreme example down here, but that is actually one of the things where you would start to see these disparities. You'd have African American children shoved into these little tiny classrooms, often with either no desk or little to with dysfunctional or broken desks, very little access to actual academic material, while on the other hand, the white students are attending very well kept, very well organized school. Another thing too is he looks at it, he goes, hey, look at spending. When we look at spending in some areas in the country, you get like a white student gets $179 at their school per student, while the African American school is only getting $43. And this money is life-changing. It's used to purchase books, it's used to purchase things for the school, and it's used to pay teachers. And so often teachers are attracted to where the best salaries are. So you usually have the best teachers that make the most money in the best schools. And then whoever couldn't find a job would often be left to go to the African American schools where they would not be able to be as well taught. I mean, I hate to say it, money determines education, but sometimes it is seen that way because often teachers are allured to where it is a net positive for them also. And other things that would happen is that a nice white school would be built next to an African American community, and then African Americans were being forced to be bused sometimes up to 5 to 10 miles away to attend the African American school. So he's showing that there's numerous reasons why this is not equal. And so he brings a case with Reverend Oliver Brown, which becomes one of the most famous court cases in U.S. history, which is Brown versus Board of Education. Reverend Brown wanted his daughter to be able to go to a school that's right next to his home instead of being bussed away. And so Thurgood Marshall takes this case and goes all the way to the Supreme Court and is eventually heard. And under the key decision, Chief Justice Earl Warren rules that separate can never be equal. He really takes and knocks down Plessy v. Ferguson. In fact, his ruling is supposed to desegregate not just schools, but other areas too, because this whole idea of separate but equal is blatantly unconstitutional. And so he's supposed to try to bring these things to the end. However, in the South, it doesn't necessarily happen, and it doesn't happen quickly. In fact, many of them, the schools themselves, refuse to desegregate. Teachers refuse to teach African American students. School administrators refuse to let African American students into the doors even. Violent protests would happen when students would try to make their way to the school. They'd be harassed. They'd be threatened with violence. They would have stuff thrown at them. They'd be terrified to even try to enter into the school. And in some cases, like in the case down in Arkansas, Governor Faubus, he refused to let him in to the point that he mobilized the National Guard and he blocked the entryways to schools. And so we start to see this and we go, well, this seems pretty extreme. And you think to yourself, yes, it is. And what really brings the attention of the American people to this issue? Well, it is a technological advancement really wakes America up, and that's the television. With the television, no longer people idly sitting back, reading it in the newspaper or hearing it on the radio. Instead, they're getting it brought to them live in their homes. And they're getting to see these moving images where they see these people getting harassed, taunted, and put into danger. And this creates a national outcry to the point that it's so loud that even President Eisenhower cannot ignore it anymore. And he does what he really was trying to fight against doing. That was to bring federal government intervention into these problems. Eventually what he does is that he nationalizes the National Guard, and then he sends the 101st Airborne down to desegregate the Little Rock High School. And he protects what are known as the Little Rock Nine. That's a pretty important thing to remember, guys. He sends them in so that he's able to desegregate them and allow them to go into school and have a protective measure over them to keep away the mobs. However, even with that happening, often these students were often harassed in the school. Teachers would refuse to teach them, and sometimes they'd even find themselves segregated inside the school in and of itself, even once they're into the school. So it takes a long time to make these monumental changes that we see now. Other things that you'd see, though, is even throughout the rest of the country, especially though in the South, is that there was continuous protests throughout this time frame. They don't die down quickly, and a lot of parents are really upset about what is going on in their schools. Now, one of the best stories that I really like comes out of these desegregation stories, especially in the school, is a story of a little girl named Ruby Bridges. Ruby Bridges, her parents wanted her to attend a school that was really close by that she could just go into, but it was a white school. And initially, the school fought against it, and they said, well, you have to pass a test to get in here. And if we know anything about tests that they try to throw at African Americans, usually they're unbalanced and they're used to try to keep them out. However, Ruby does manage to pass the test. And so the thing is, though, is many people, especially parents, objected to having an African-American child in the school with their children. And they protested, and it became dangerous and scary for Ruby to be able to go to school. And eventually she's assigned 4 federal marshals who each and every day would walk with Ruby and her mom to school and back to give her that safety and that measure of security. And little Ruby, when she got into the school, though, she found that no teachers were willing to teach her except for one. And this one teacher, he took her into a room and they sat there and they had lessons together all by herself each and every day. But they said one thing about Ruby is that she was highly dedicated to her education. She never missed a day of school, and she always was a hard worker. And eventually she did graduate from school, and later on in life she was able to meet back up with that teacher again, and they did a number of interviews together about the experiences that they had. Now, the story of Ruby, you can also find a lot of that information online now. There was very recently a lot of stories published about her in honor of her bravery in the face of such adversity. And so if you're really interested in learning more, there's a whole lot more out there. Okay, guys? All right, well, that does it here for 27.3. Again, give me feedback, guys, if you like this format, and that way we'll ensure that we continue it on. Also, you need to make sure that you read this week, because there's a couple things on this upcoming homework quiz that I have put on there that is only found within your book and not on this PowerPoint. So make sure you are still looking over your book and that you're reading some elements of that, okay? All right, guys, appreciate it, and have yourself a good rest of the day.